Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the 11th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I am Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and I am moderating the Reference and Readers Advisory track. Assisting me today is Angela Schneider with the Winnifox Library System, and we are so glad to have you here. Our presenter for this morning is Katie Stover with the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library, and she will be discussing Reading from the Ears Up, Appeal of the Audiobook. So Katie, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. This is me testing the sound and saying thank you for joining us this morning for Reading from the Ears Up. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite formats, audiobooks. And I've been listening since audiobooks came on two kinds of cassettes, abridged and unabridged. Back then, the dilemma was spend your minimal audiobook budget on 20 abridged audiobook cassettes or 5 unabridged audiobook cassettes. So tell me I'm not a decrepit old lady and that some of you know what a cassette is. But we're going to look at some numbers and then put this format in some context. And then we're going to look at some methods for listening. And then we'll get to the fun part, the elements of appeal and the different subgenres of audiobooks. We'll look at resources for listening about audiobooks, reviews, awards, and some reminders about how to keep audiobooks in your own RAI, thus that of the public. And along the way, I'm hoping that you'll share some of your favorite audiobook titles, any narrators, any questions you might have, share podcasts as well as audiobooks. Feel free to tell us about audiobooks you absolutely adore and will listen to over and over again, audiobooks you hated. Same thing for podcasts, because a lot of what we talk about here can be applicable to finding library users a new podcast as well. So now let's look at some of these numbers. It looks like a very colorful jumble of mess of numbers, but every number tells a story about our reader and listeners. And when we know some of the details about our readers' stories, we can do better creating suggested reading lists or doing listeners' advisory with them. So these stats come from the APA's annual report for 2022, and it's measuring everything that's revenue and sales for 2022. So first thing is who? 46% of the respondents said that they had listened to audiobook, and that's an increase over 2020. 56% of respondents 45 years and younger listen to audiobooks, and that's up from 52%. 81.4% of audiobook engagers surveyed said that they have a library card compared to 75.8% of the general survey population. There's greater percentages of people of color. 19.6% of listeners are Black, 16.4% are Latinx. And they said that they engage with audiobooks compared to the general survey population. Audiobook engagers surveyed said that they rely heavily on word of mouth for book discovery, with 21.6% citing friends and 13.6% citing family and 10.1% citing social media. So science fiction barely edged out mystery, thriller, suspense for the very first time this year, followed very closely by a shave of a percentage point romance, self-help. Majority of listeners are listening at home, and that's increasing all the time. 30% are listening in the car. That's a little bit of a decrease from 2019. No wonder, because of the pandemic. The household listening increased. No wonder, since 2019. Again, pandemic. 70% of the surveyed folks listen while multitasking, and that should not come as a surprise either. And most folks like to listen while they do other things. If your library is spending more on digital audio, I hope you're not surprised, because this is one of the fastest growing segments in publishing. Libraries spend almost $153 million in audiobooks. Digital, physical, one copy, one user, and cost per click combined. They spend $138 million on one copy, one user, and $14,000 on cost per click. That's 90% versus 10%. And how are people listening? No surprise, physical audio took a plunge in 2021, but digital audio continues to grow. The listener's favorite place to listen is at home. And while the car was the most popular spot, most frequent listening, as I said, done during multitasking. Fun fact, there were over 71,000 new audio titles produced in 2021. So this is a very general picture using the numbers to paint with. We're seeing our thriller digital audios being used by listeners in their 20s and 30s, and they're eagerly browsing our increased digital audio collection, because what else are we going to spend collection dollars on during the pandemic? So what are listeners listening with? How are they sticking the books in their ears? They're listening via their smartphones, their smart speakers, their tablets, their computers. In-dash audio systems are on the rise as more cars improve the in-auto entertainment systems. Don't forget, there are still older cars out on the road than this year's model. There's still plenty of cars out there with CD players. And if you're wondering why is your library still collecting books on CD, that's partially why. There are still users that love audiobooks that still have CD Walkmans, that still have CD players at home. And very, very few folks are still listening to audiobooks on cassette. Those are super hard to find. And I would love to know if your library is still collecting those, because it's been 20 years since my libraries have been collecting audiobooks on cassette. So those two library sources for digital downloads should look familiar. Patrons are loving Hoopla because the no lines, no waiting, but Overdrive still has more of the more popular in-demand content. Audible, most popular consumer site for digital audio, and Audible now has that Amazon muscle behind it to acquire a lot of independently produced audiobooks and original audiobooks with no print equivalent, otherwise known as audio originals. All of the other services have a business model similar to Audible's, iTunes, Libro FM, eStories, Scribd. You pay a monthly fee and you get access to the company's entire audio catalog. There are some other extras. Libro FM allows users to target favorite independent bookstores for your purchases. eStories and audiobooks.com both have digital audio services. Audiobooks.com is a little bigger than eStories, but eStories has some music and music NFTs. Scribd has their ebooks, the digital audio, some long form articles, magazines, and sheet music. That surprised me. So independently published content and original content. Downpour is owned by Blackstone Audio, who does great work on audio. The content of their titles seems to be a little below the others. There's no fixed number provided, but it operates similar to Audible, audiobooks and the audiobooks.com and the others. So now let's take a real quick look at some industry trends. So it helps to know some of these trends in the audiobook industry, because you'll craft better lists knowing what these trends are. So listeners are using their phones, which means listeners are far more mobile while listening and likely prone to getting interrupted. And because of that, listeners are saying that their preferred length is 1 to 3 hours. And that's about the length of a week's total commute in the car or a really good walk 3 times a week. Surveyed listeners prefer professional narrators over the authors, except for one category, and we'll talk about that category in a little bit. This helps us know, helps us make lists, because get to know who the rock star narrators are, and you can build a list of just that person's audiobooks. And the majority of those rock star narrators, they don't just read one genre, they'll read all manner of things. And so you'll put together a really cool list with one narrator and probably help a fan discover some titles they would never have learned about otherwise. Really terrific way to open up a reader to discovery. We've all talked about actors who will go see in anything. There are audiobook listeners who experience that sort of narrator lust. One of the questions that Jean asked earlier was to put in the chat if there's a particular narrator you like. My narrator lust is reserved for Tom Steckschulte, Dion Graham, Katie Kellgren, and Bonnie Turpin. They are wonderful narrators. They can do a variety of voices. So if you build a list using what you know about the trends, you can have great crime fiction in audio, or best science fiction and fantasy in audio, You can have a list that's just really short, 3 hours and under. Take a walk, take a drive. I'm going to talk a little bit about production values. A poorly produced or voiced audiobook of even the most fantastic title will only frustrate your listeners. Consequently, a high quality audio production of a meh title can keep a listener engaged. So narrators have a lot of control over the appeal of a title. And I have experienced this. Barbara Rosenblatt, one of the most decorated narrators out there, and some of you may recognize that name from Orange is the New Black. She played Rosa. Barbara Rosenblatt narrated an audiobook that I thought that I loathed from beginning to end. And I finally had to quit. And the only thing that kept me going was her fantastic narration. But really good narration can also elevate those weak spots in a book. So really good narration can keep you glued. Really poor narration can make you stop listening to a terrific book. And if that happens, go find it in print. But we've all seen movies that have been redeemed by one terrific performance by a favorite actor. Same. So when it comes to audiobooks, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I'll go into a little more detail. Reviews and listener feedback matter in this format. So take a moment to read comments and reviews whenever you're researching a title or a particular audiobook genre. And we'll chat about reviews and sources later, but keep that in mind. And then just to reassure everyone, have no fear. Audio listeners also read 15 books or ebooks a year. A reader is a listener, is a reader. The book isn't going anywhere. It's adapting to the user's needs and demands of the time. That's what's making audiobooks so popular these days. So now we get to some of the fun part. We're going to dive into what you know using your reader's advisory knowledge. So we're breaking down the audiobook a little bit. It's more than just sticking a book in your ear. So I want you all to take a moment to think about what you know about your basic reader's advisory appeals: storyline, pacing, tone, writing style, and how those appeals translate to a different format in audio. Because adding audio to those elements of appeal enhances the vocal quality, enhances all of those other RA appeals. You're going to want to describe the voice quality. You're going to want to describe the tone and the artistic delivery of the narrator. You're also going to identify what type of performance or narration you're listening to, because there are a lot of differences. There's a difference between multi-voiced audiobooks and full cast, and we're going to get into that in a moment. You're also going to want to listen for the extras that audiobooks can provide that a print book can't provide: songs or interviews or codas at the end of a title. So now let's start with an easy subgenre of audiobooks, read by the author. And this one's really very popular. And while I'm talking about this category, feel free to post your favorite, not so favorite audiobooks read by authors, because read by the author seems to work best, in my experience, in chatting with other audiobook listeners, in reading the reviews. Narrators who read their own works that are memoirs, this works really well, as well also for autobiographies. There are a handful of fiction authors who do exceptional narration of their own works. And I'm going to name drop Barbara Kingsolver, Amy Tan, and Neil Gaiman. Babs and Amy have narrated their own work, and they are terrific at it. They are marvelous narrators. They don't do anyone else's work, but they're top-notch at their own. Neil Gaiman likes to do his own work, and he hires out to do other work too. If you haven't caught him in The Witches of Lublin, it's an audio original, you're missing a treat. He does a terrific job as a unlikable character, but he likes to read his own work, and he's really good at it. He's actually won awards for it. Authors doing memoirs, there are certain passages that'll take on a more of an emotional resonance since the author has a stronger connection. So it can make a listener feel closer to the author and the work. It feels more authentic to the audiobook listener. But some authors just aren't good at narrating their own works, whether it's memoir or not. Stephen King admits freely that he's not good at narrating his own work. Some authors are one-hit wonders. Paul Auster was terrific narrating Book of Illusions, but he didn't narrate any of his other work. And being good at reading one passage aloud or several does not a professional narrator make. There's a lot of work that goes into narrating, and that is a topic and a webinar for another time. If I had another half an hour, I would talk to you about how an audiobook is made. Want to point out that there are some bonuses. Society's Child by Janice Ian, big bonus, because not only does she narrate her autobiography, she drops her songs and sings them at appropriate places in the audio. That's the sort of enhanced content that you can't get in the print version of Janice Ian's autobiography. And it's not just performance. Where she's putting the songs, they help advance the narrative, kind of like a Broadway musical, or they illustrate how she was influenced to write the song at that point in her life. And sometimes these songs illustrate how she was feeling and what she was experiencing at that point in her life. That is a really powerful autobiography for people who like biographies, memoirs, but stories about people. So now I want to talk a little bit about distinctly voiced. Readers like distinctly voiced books because it's easier for them to keep track of the numerous characters. So distinctly voiced is typically one narrator who's got a catalog of voices in their repertoire that's just astounding. Voice actors really like distinctly voiced books because it sharpens their acting chops and it gives them character opportunities that they might not get otherwise in film work. So the narrator will adjust their voice using breath or pitch or accents. Michael Urie really does sound like a dachshund with the stop and go voice of Lily in Lily and the Octopus. Kate Redding is outstanding at men's voices since she has a register that's mid-range. And consequently, conversely, Simon Vance is a narrator that's very good with women's voices. He's done lots of romance. Distinctly voiced titles, like I said, one narrator typically, sometimes there's two. More than that, and the book starts to sidle into multi-voice territory. And the narrator out there who is the gold medalist in narration with distinctly voiced, Jim Dale, doing that whole Harry Potter series. He is a master, over 600 voices in that catalog. So now multi-voice performance, which I mentioned, that's lots of actors doing single parts. The epitome, my favorite example of a multi-voice performance is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. It's a full cast of 166 narrators. It may seem like audio drama, but it's not. They're all reading these separate parts the way George Saunders wrote the work. Audio dramas can sound like old-time radio plays with music and sound effects and other enhancements. And there's a little bit of that in Lincoln in the Bardo. Think Prairie Home Companion. LA Theater Works puts out some of the best audio dramas out there. And they pull in lots of well-known actors to do recorded versions of classic plays. These are great for students who hesitate to read Shakespeare. Give them an LA Theater Works production and they will understand what it is they're listening to. If you're looking for a podcast equivalent, I just found this one, Homecoming. It's a couple of years old, but these multi-voice performances are just, they're amazing and people love them because they come with so much more resonance. Enhanced audiobooks, these can seem like a multi-voice full cast production, but think more like a movie in your mind. And that is the tagline from Graphic Audio that created this Star Wars The Force Awakens production. So it's like a comic book or a graphic novel in audio format. There's big sound effects, there's a lot of music, there's a large cast, there's sometimes over the top dramatic performances of what you're listening to. Like I said, think old time radio drama. Enhanced can also mean added content. So there's an interview with G. Sands about the process of narrating in Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. If you listen to the special edition of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, it's narrated by Claire Danes, but Margaret Atwood wrote an extra piece a coda for this book. If you remember that Handmaid's Tale ends with that symposium Q&A, they recorded a Q&A at the end of Handmaid's Tale that Margaret Atwood wrote, and then there's an extra essay narrated by Valerie Martin, written and narrated by Valerie Martin for the Handmaid's Tale. So you get the book, but you get a little more context and actually even a little looking forward to what happens at the end of the Handmaid's Tale. So genres in audio, really popular. Romance is one of the biggest money makers in audiobooks, and it's the genre that grew the most in sales in 2021. It went up 75%. And even though it went up 75%, it still slid under, as far as all the genres, that's 75% of the genre sales. It's still overall running a really tight race, a shaved percentage point with mystery, crime, and suspense, which is like 1 percentage point below science fiction and fantasy. They came out on top this year. But have a look in your own libraries about what's checking out and getting returned. And I know that what you're only going to be able to see is what's in CD. But here's a little side note. This might be a really good time to ask collection development to run a circulation report asking for format figures and genre breakdowns, and see what's really popular with your library's users in the audiobook format. And although folks don't like to talk about it, self-help is very popular in the audiobook format, likely because no one can see what you're reading when you're listening to self-help. Self-help seems to do far better in audio than podcast format, even though there's a ton of self-help podcasts, people that are telling you life hacks and how to do your life better. But we're finding that self-help is really one of the bigger trends in the audiobook industry. And I mentioned earlier about how knowing what the trends are helps you build good lists. You can dedicate several lists to just terrific audio in a particular genre. We'll talk about where to find those titles a little bit later in the webinar. If you're looking for a really good podcast, a couple of podcasts to match with these different genres, I found Electric Easy, which is a science fiction romance, Rabbits, which is a suspense, 1865 historical, and Showmance, which is like a rom-com. And these are all fictional podcasts. So if you've got folks who are listening to fiction podcasts, it's not that hard to push them over to audiobooks, and same, not that hard to slide folks from audiobooks to fiction podcasts. And if it sounds like I'm promoting a service that your library doesn't offer, i.e. podcasts, yeah, I am, because what I think we as readers advisors are more interested in is becoming places of discovery. We want our libraries to be trusted resources for our users to find content that matches what they're in the mood for. So circ figures are great, and I know that they're uppermost in the minds of some folks we work with. They're uppermost in my mind too, but it slides in. It's one of the top 3 priorities when I'm doing readers advisory, and it's not even number 1, and frequently it's not number 2. I'm interested in promoting trust and making my readers advisory colleagues and all of you trusted sources in the community for suggesting good reading, because there's nothing in it for us when it comes to suggesting. We're not making a percentage on whatever it is we circulate. No one's making their first million working in a library. Our bankable commodity is trust. So readers advisory is about building trust. That's why I don't mind recommending things that other libraries have, recommending movies, TV, podcasts. We're not going to make a percentage of that. But what's really important is that our users trust us and they'll keep coming back. Trust is what makes people keep coming back. So my minor RA side detour there. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about debunking myths. I'm hoping that most of the people on this webinar are already audiobook fans. And if you are, and you talk to your friends and patrons and family about audiobooks, you've probably heard someone say, well, that's not really reading. If you did hear that, please vote it in the chat and tell me that story. There's still some stigma out there about audiobooks. I can't believe I still hear it. but listening counts whether you're counting minutes or hours or titles and pages. And I say that about minutes and hours, titles and pages, because I mostly hear the that's not reading argument during my library summer reading program. Listening matters, and here's why. Because audio ties you to the text, unlike a book. There's no skipping. We've all read print books where we've gotten to a point in the text where we're either bored or we're uncomfortable, or it's just there's just too much explication and description and we don't need it, or we don't understand it. I tend to skip the really sciencey parts of science fiction. You can't do that in audio. So when I listened to The Martian by Andy Weir, which is fantastic in audio, I had to listen to the science. But when I was reading The Martian by Andy Weir, I could skip the science. Your eyes can skip what your ears cannot. So actually, you're doing more reading when you're listening because you're getting all of the words. It's really hard to skip ahead with your audio on your devices because you have no idea how far 15 or 30 seconds is going to take you and what you might miss. That's an important plot point. Right before you all joined us, Jean and I were talking about speeding up the narration, and it's a hotly contested debate in the audiobook industry, but sometimes it's necessary. There are times when the original track for narration is just too slow a pace. So Jean says she speeds up, I think, 1.5. That's not a lot, folks.
Nope, 1.15.
1.15. Oh, I speed up 1.1. And that's because I start to hear just a little too much airtime in between words or sentences or paragraphs, and that doesn't alter it very much. I have heard folks say that they'll speed up to 2 times. That's a lot in audiobook land. So I just want to point out, I'm not saying it's bad to speed up. Be careful saying that if you're in the presence of professional narrators, because some of them think that you're speeding past their wonderful performance. Remember, they're actors, they have egos. But some content and context can get lost in a rush. So if you're one of those folks that wants to speed up and experiment with that, just be mindful. Because our ears can read. Sometimes our ears can read faster than our eyes. But consider the level of comprehension if you're speeding up. How much are you going to retain if you're really speeding up your audio and you're missing some info? I have found that when I speed things up, it works best for like nonfiction that's rather instructive or educational. But reading or listening, it's not a land speed record sport. Reading, listening, it's a marathon with rewards that can appear later and sometimes unexpectedly. So I'm not necessarily saying sometimes speeding is great. If the audiobook is bad and you're speeding because you need to get to the end, then just really shoot to the end or stop listening, because life is too short to listen to things that you are not enjoying. So how do we talk to people about our audiobooks? What does the audio readers advisory conversation look like? You know, it can start as easily as, what are you listening to? And that can be enough to get your conversational ball rolling. But if you need to do a deeper dive, then here's a couple of questions, especially if you're working with library patrons. Where do you listen? Are you listening at home? Are you listening in the car? Are you going on a family vacation and you need to choose something for a family? That can matter a lot. I have done a lot of that sort of reader's advisory. It's almost a moot point now to ask about abridged or unabridged, because almost everything out there is unabridged. But talk about it if the conversation leads you there. Describe what kind of voice you like, and listeners might not be familiar with the narrators who are the rock star narrators unless they're celebrities. So talk about male voices, female voices, high voices, low voices, mid-range, accents. That can matter. I run into folks who say they can't listen to British accents. They just don't understand what's being said. Good terms to use are growly or craggy, whispery, sweet, lilting. You can ask listeners to talk about their favorite singers and what they like about that person's voice or music, and then try and match that. What you're doing is you're trying to give your listener patrons some of the vocabulary that they can use back with you, and then you can do a better job matching them to the next audiobook that they want. And there are all sorts of ways to do passive reader's advisory with audiobooks. And I'm sure that a lot of this will look familiar, and I'll bet most of you are already doing this already in your displays. That's really great. Create face-out audiobook displays, include audiobooks in staff recommendation lists and other displays. So put the CDs on audio, the audiobook CDs in places with your regular book displays. Whenever you make a list for your website or in BiblioCommons or in your catalog, always hang the digital audio title as well as a print title. Cross promote your audio and print in the same display, especially at author events or other library events. A lot of this stuff is really basic, and this slide is mostly here to remind you that audiobooks, while it's great if you can give them just their own display, that's wonderful. Don't forget to work them into other displays on other topics. There's an audiobook on everything out there at this, in this day and age. So now, where do we go to discover great audiobooks? So these are the places where I look first when I'm looking for other audios, especially if I'm serving a request for a title that will appeal across all the ages. So that amazing audiobooks list from YALSA and the Odyssey Award are my two go-tos when I'm asked for listening from for youth or for teens. The listen list, that goes back to 2012, and it includes 12 of the top audiobooks, fiction and nonfiction, of the designated year, and at least 3 read-alikes for each entry on the list. This is a list crafted by the RUSA Listen List Committee. It's all librarians from academic, public, school, and that and they put together for you, when you're done counting, 36 top-notch audio titles. That is a listener's buffet. I can't tout this award enough as a resource. It's my favorite go-to for listeners who ask me the most basic RA question: give me a good audiobook. You can point someone to this list and they'll find something to appeal to them, because there's all sorts of work on there. 36 no-fail titles on any year that you pick. I'm headed to New Orleans tomorrow for the Live Learn X, and on Sunday night, I'll be getting the 2022 Listen List Award, and I really can't wait to see what they come up with. Audio Industry Awards. So the previous slide was just all ALA sanctioned audiobook awards. This is the Audio Industry Awards, and the biggest is the Audio Awards. That recognizes distinction in audiobooks and spoken word entertainment, and it's sponsored by the Audio Publishers Association, the APA. Those are the folks that did the stats you saw in slide 2. The Independent Audiobook Awards, they recognize distinction in audiobooks, game lit, and spoken word entertainment, and they're sponsored by the Here Now Audio Fiction and Arts Festival. It debuted as the Audiobook Listener Awards in 2018, and it's given to independently produced audiobook awards. The Audio Awards also factor in independence, but that's where you'll see awards for the for audiobooks put out by the large publishers. The E.B. White Read Aloud Award, I include that one for anyone on this webinar who does listeners advisory with parents or children, because the E.B. White Read Aloud Award is given to a middle grade title and some picture book titles. It's not been given out since 2019. It was established in 2004, and it was given by the American Booksellers Association. And right about 2019 is when the American Booksellers Association transitioned to Book Expo. But this is still a great resource for suggestions for parents. A lot of classic, terrific titles on that E.B. White Read Aloud Award. And you don't hear a lot about it. You didn't hear a lot about it at the time it was being given out. I include the Grammy Awards because while it's mostly given for music, they do have a best spoken word album category. It's for poetry, audiobooks, and storytelling. They also award a Grammy for best children's album. Those awards you'll never see on TV. Those are given in that quiet ceremony, usually happens at lunch. But I include the Grammy Awards because we should know about them. They give an award for an audiobook. They typically give the award to an audiobook that's narrated or written and narrated by a celebrity. Bill Clinton was narrated, Barack Obama was nominated. They've won, Hillary Clinton's won a Grammy. I think the Grammys hope that those folks show up to pick up the awards, and they never do. The Grammy Awards website, I'll be honest, is terrible when it comes to searching for awards. There are other awards far more useful for our work in Reader's Advisory and audiobooks, but they are listed here because they are the most recognizable award for the general public. Online resources. This is where I go for audiobook news and suggestions, and these are good ones for everyone to keep in their hip pocket. AudioFile magazine, probably the best. AudioFile is the only review source devoted to the voice industry, and it's nothing but reviews and features on audiobooks, all kinds of audiobooks, independently produced, fiction, nonfiction, genre, originals, other features. AudioFile has snippets of some books on SoundCloud. They have interviews with narrators. They dive into the industry and give you a little bit more of how it's done. They also have a podcast called Behind the Mic. Sync is their audiobook program for teens, and it always happens in the summer. And I think almost anybody can participate. In 2023, AudioFile expects to give away 28 titles over a 14-week period. That's 2 free audiobook titles per week, 2 complete audiobook downloads. And it pairs high interest titles based on weekly themes. So if you want teams to become more engaged with reading through listening, this is a really cool program to get them in touch with. The Audio Publishers Association is the professional association attached to the voice industry. Look for stats and news from APA. They also support and host the Audio Awards. Members can attend special webinars, trainings, workshops for free. If you run into anyone who has an interest in becoming an audiobook narrator, there is a site on the APA website devoted solely to how to become a professional audiobook narrator. I include novelists here because they have created a terrific vocabulary for audio appeal that you can find in the novelist database. Their newsletters are also a great RA resource for audiobooks. I include Spotify because they're starting to load up some audiobooks, and I'll be interested to see how that moves forward for them. Other resources I use. So combine some of those podcast listening skills with your audiobook RA skills. Very similar techniques, storytelling techniques, and qualities of appeal. For audiobook reviewing assistance, or just describe how you would describe an audiobook, check out that audiobook lexicon. You can, if you've ever learned to read a book in 15 minutes, there's an audiobook adaptation of that exercise. Sounds good to me. That link will take you to how to listen to audiobooks, what to listen for if you're going to review, what to listen for if you're just going to speak intelligently and evaluate an audiobook. A couple of blogs and a couple of podcast resources I use, Hot Pod and Podcast Review. There are probably others, and if you know of others, I would love to see them in the chat. These are the 2 I'm using right now, and I like to read how reviewers talk about podcasts, especially the ones that have like a season, like 10 or more episodes, 8 or more episodes. I like to hear how the reviewers evaluate the voice, the storytelling, the narrative flow, other enhancements. Those are things that show up in your audiobook reviews. So I like to see how podcast reviewers are talking about those things. That's why I'm starting to talk about podcasts a little bit more when I talk about audiobooks, because I'm finding that folks are listening to both and there's a lot of overlap. So some sample lists. I know that I talked about creating sample lists that are just audio based. Here's a handful. Just one voice. That one is single narrator audiobooks, distinctly voiced, like go-to distinctly voiced titles. We created one for multi-voice audiobooks. Those are really good audiobooks to give to folks who get, I'm confused, I can't keep track. Full cast audiobooks for, drama, all-time drama. And then verbal wallpaper. I didn't talk about this earlier, but there are audiobooks with detached narrators, and what those, they're going to be less distinctly voiced. That's where the narrator just sort of disappears into the text and you get wrapped up in the story and less wrapped up in the drama of different voices and who all the characters are. It's not that the narrator's doing a bad job speaking in different voices. They're more focused on making sure that the story, the characters are in your mind, and you actually participate a little bit more as a listener when the narrator is detached, because you don't have all the color commentary, you don't have all the accents. The narrator, the detached narrator, is helping you engage your imagination a little bit more with the audiobook. They have Listen to Your Heart, favorite romances in audio, and then work in progress, audiobooks for self-care or self-help. And if you want more lists, such as these slides, or a list of all of the audiobooks that appeared on the slides, because all of the audiobooks that appeared on the slides appeared on best of lists, year-end best lists. They are Audio Award winners or go-to all-time favorites. So you will find that list. You will find links to different articles on the presentation here, as well as this recording, which I know that Jean is going to make available to all of you who are attending the Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. So I'm going to stop for a moment, sip some water, and have Jean unmute and throw out some questions that you might have.
Thank you, Katie. So I'm going to scroll back to a question that came in. It was when you were talking about your favorite narrators. And I know you know exactly who they are, but if you could say those again so I can write them down and put them in the chat. Someone was wondering about those.
Well, one of them, I'm going to write the first one because the first person's name is Tom Steckschulte.
Okay.
I
wouldn't be able to spell that one.
Right, so I'm doing it for you.
Good, thank you.
I mentioned Barbara Rosenblatt.
I love her.
Oh, she is the queen. I mentioned Bonnie Turpin and Dion Graham. Dion Graham has won so many awards, so is Bonnie Turpin, and Dion Graham is like a chameleon. You don't even know you're listening to Dion Graham until you look at what the narrator is. So he narrated Evicted by Matt Desmond, that Pulitzer Prize winning novel from a couple of years ago. He was also the narrator for Marlon James' first book, Red Wolf, Black Leopard. Oh, I'm probably getting that backwards, but the follow-up to that, Moon Witch Spider King, Bonnie Turpin is the narrator for that. Bonnie Turpin also does Children of Blood and Bone, which was fantastic. Barbara Rosenblatt is the voice of Bridget Jones' Diary. And I had to meet her to realize that the narrator was not a 30-something chubby British woman, and that she's actually a short, round Brooklyn grandmother type. Who strolled through a bar demanding a whiskey, and I knew that we had to be really good friends. She is, and she actually taught me how to eat escargot.
Good stories.
Yeah.
There was a comment early on, and I just will remind everyone, we have some time. So if you have questions about audiobook listeners advisory or anything else, we have some time. So go ahead and put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A panel. And there was a comment earlier about audio keeps people with dyslexia and other disabilities. It helps students keep up with their classmates. Many studies show that listening while reading helps pronunciation as well.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for including those important reminders about how many people out there are oral learners, they're audible learners. I mean, we're all not visual learners.
And then there's a question, do you have experience or suggestions for programming with audiobooks, like audiobook clubs, other ways to connect audio/podcast fans to each other in our libraries?
Finding the audiobook podcast fans in your libraries is the same way as we find the romance fans. You learn who reads what by talking to the strangers. So talk to your public, especially your audiobook patrons, about what they're listening to. Again, going back to the trust, the more you communicate, the better base of trust you build up. Audiobook book clubs. We don't have any in my library, but I know that we incorporate audiobook editions into every book club selection that we make for all of the book clubs at KCPL. We have an online book club that only chooses works from Hoopla. So that means that if it's in print or audio, we're working it in that way. If you did an audiobook only book club, then one of the elements you'd want to talk about is the narration. And just what does the narration do for the text? We have had that conversation in several of my book clubs when I've had some readers who listen to the book and some who have read the print version. And then we'll talk about what the audio, the folks who have listened, will talk about how the audio is a little bit different from the print, how it was enhanced, what emotions they experienced. But when it comes to just devoting a book club to audio, I think that's great. I've found that I'm just including audio in any of my book groups. Whenever we talk about the format, whenever we tell them the book's available, we give them all the available formats: digital, audio, print. And as far as programming, it would be a lot of fun. I haven't done this, but I've been cooking this idea for a while. It would be a lot of fun to get a professional narrator to come in and talk about how they do it, and then maybe read a passage. And I shouldn't say we've never done it. We have done it at Kansas City Public Library, because the Here Now Festival was held in Kansas City every June, and the library was a supporter of the Here Now Festival. So every year we had a bunch of narrators on a stage, either doing readings or talking about their craft or offering master classes. So yes, but all that rock star audio talent was being brought in by somebody else.
That's awesome. Is that the Here Now, HEARNOW?
HEAR. And I know they just changed the name of the festival. I know they just changed it. So if you search for Here Now Festival, you will find their page.
Cool.
You will find the new name.
Yes. I think early on I put in George Guadal as one of my favorite narrators. He's such a nice man. So you mentioned APA, and one of the things that I loved to do when I would go to the PLA conference, Public Library Association conference, was go to the what was it called? The publisher dinner or APA dinner?
Yeah.
Yes.
APA dinner.
I loved that because I got to hear and see these people that I had listened to for so long in person, and sometimes they were so different than what I pictured in my head. But George Goodall was so nice and so friendly. And afterwards, I heard him speak. I think he told everybody his email address and said, "I will come and speak at your library," or whatever. So I don't know if he still does that, because I think isn't he in his 80s?
Oh, he's been around forever.
Ever. Yeah. Yes.
And yes, Katie Kelgren. That is so sad. She was such a talent. She was one of the,
Yes.
we were lucky enough to have her at the Here Now Festival the very first year they hosted the festival. She is a delight. She was just so much fun, and what a marvelous narrator she was.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, so if you have audiobook narrators that they might be in your community and not know about it, so they would be great to have for programming. Let's see what else came in. Oh, for those of you who are in Wisconsin, we have access to novelists statewide. So you have access to those resources that Katie mentioned. And then we also have a statewide collection of for Overdrive for Libby. So we have a pretty robust audiobook collection statewide as well. So we should have lots of options for your patrons in Wisconsin. Let's see.
Oh, I see that Deborah mentioned that audio versions of books are coming out sooner.
Oh, yes.
There, Deborah, there's been a lot. The print publishers have noticed that simultaneous issue of audiobook with the print books is doing their bottom line a lot of good. And that a lot of that started with Harry Potter. There were so many folks that became vested in listening to Harry Potter and didn't want to read it, that the audio versions had to drop the same time as the print. And a lot of publishers are seeing the benefit of that and not waiting for an audiobook to come out, 8 months later. There are folks that want to listen. So that's almost become de rigueur now in publishing. And when you don't see that, because I didn't see that with a popular book, and I thought, why? And I learned later that a publisher had kind of dropped the ball. And they were like, oh, how did we forget to do this? So, and then interesting side note, audio rights are usually different from print rights. So one particular publisher might own the print rights and the ebook rights, and they might not own the audio rights.
Yes, I found that fascinating. I think that I forget which series I was listening to. I don't remember which one, but I remember they switched narrators for the main character partway through. And I think it was because the audio rights got bought by a different publisher and a different narrator then. And I remember there being like, this isn't so-and-so's voice, whoever the character was. And, so I know that, is that as much of an issue that you've noticed lately that the narrators are changing?
Yes, I'm so glad someone mentioned it. The last time there was a dust up, it was over Janet Ivanovich's book.
That might have been what I was thinking of.
Yeah, Angela's right. And it was the Stephanie Plum series. And I think that's the first time that happened, and it just got a lot of notice, and fans were livid. They did not like the new narrator. And I think that series is on. The most current narrator is Barbara Rosenblatt, I believe. I'll be perfectly honest, folks. I stopped reading Stephanie Plum, I think at book 9. There's a lot of them now. But I know that the narrator changed. I know that the publisher went back to the original narrator after the narrator that nobody liked. Those of you who are fans of Louise Penny and her Three Pines series know that recently there's been a change in narrator, and the change in narrator is because the original narrator died. Those of you who like, if you like the Phryne Fisher mystery series by, I think it's Stephanie Daniels, but that narrator also died not too long ago, and they've moved on to a new narrator. That's an Australian mystery series, cozy mystery series. Kind of salty, his cozy mystery series. But yeah, it's so now as listeners, we're a little more tolerant, but yep, Angela hit on the big drama.
Yes, I do remember that. So let's see. There was a comment that we're buying less and less physical audiobooks and relying more and more on our Wisconsin's digital library collection. Many people don't have anywhere to play a physical CD, but some still do have a need for it. So they're always trying to find the balance in all that they do. So yes, and I'm glad we have the Wisconsin's digital library to help out there. A question from Catherine. We are a small little library and we removed headphone checkout due to COVID. Our audiobook CD, our audiobook CD checkout decreased. Would getting a boombox for checkout help with this issue, do you think?
Oh, Catherine, what I would suggest is that if you're a small library, maybe get a boombox for listening in the library. You probably don't want to circulate the boombox, because then it's gone and it's just, that's one. I mean, you don't want to invest in that many boomboxes. But there are probably smaller players that you could invest in and just check them out for in-library use, and that might boost your CD circulation as well, because when someone checks out one of the little CD players for in-house use, they check out the CD at the same time. But that's a really intriguing idea. I think that's rather creative, and it's never occurred to me to get something like that to listen to. We have folks that would watch our DVDs in the library, so why not have them listen to our CDs? And getting a couple of small CD players might improve the circulation of your music CD collection as well.
True. And talking about that, and the next question is about asking what other libraries have experienced with regard to playaways or other pre-recorded MP3 players.
Everybody with experience with that format, please chime in. Playaways have been very successful at my library. People like them because they're preloaded. They don't need to muck around with their phone. They can just pop in their earbuds, leave their phone at home, and go for a walk. And they can be truly unplugged and undisturbed. They're just listening to their audiobook. We've had good experiences with those. They're popular. I think they're a little bit more popular than our audiobook CDs, simply because they're so self-contained.
Yes, and a follow-up comment to that, Callie says, since audiobooks can be hard to get right away on Libby, yes, they have long hold lists for some of them. They're purchasing little speakers that can be plugged directly into playaways to circulate, and also helping people connecting their playaways to cars and portable speakers. Callie, I'm intrigued by the little speakers that you mentioned, so if you could share what they are, like a link to where you found them, because I can't picture what this little speaker looks like that you're plugging into the playaways. So, and then there was a comment about wishing playaways weren't so expensive. And yes, I agree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yes, children like playaways.
Children are the one that like the playaways more than the adults.
Yes.
I don't know why.
It's just because it's easy. It's a little thing. Oh.
Yeah, it is probably just easy.
Yep, and the new Wonder books, Rosalia says, have been really popular at their library too. So it's good to see that the audiobooks, starting young and we, keep doing them. So, oh, thanks, Callie, for putting that link in there. And I'll make sure that gets shared with our follow-up information as well. Catherine says the kids like it because they can put it in their pocket and still go on adventures. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Catherine. And we're at 11:28, so we just have a couple of minutes left. Yes, thank you, Angela, for sharing the stretch break that's coming up next at noon. Any other last minute questions? Otherwise, I think I will wrap up for this morning.
It's been a delight, everyone. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm going to really quickly put my email in the chat here for anyone who had questions that come to you later.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Catherine asks if the slides will be shared. Yes, we will be sharing the slides. Katie will have her slides here, and I'm also going to send her the chat log. So we'll collect all of the titles that we collected earlier and the narrators and things like that. We'll compile those into a list that'll be shared afterwards as well. All right, go ahead. Did you have?
I was gonna say, yep. Look for the updates of all the authors, all the titles of the podcast you shared. That'll be on the wiki link that Jean sends you out. I'll be doing that this afternoon.
Okay, that'll probably go out tomorrow. We'll send the link. We'll add your link to the Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference page and send that. That'll get sent out tomorrow. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do the closing. So thank you so much, Katie, for this great session. I know all of our to be listened to lists are much longer. There will be a short survey at the end of the webinar and also sent to you via email. We really appreciate your feedback. Our next session in this track is with Stephanie Sandala and begins at 1 p.m. We hope to see you there, and if not, we hope you have a great rest of your day. All right. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks all.
Have a good rest of your day.
Conference.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye.